Hey everyone, welcome to the Open Inquiry podcast. I am Danylo Zubariev. So today I'm speaking with Alison Melia about relationship abuse. Alison has a degree in sociology and has worked in social services for over 11 years. And currently she is a partner assault response facilitator at New Directions, where she conducts group therapy sessions for individuals who have been charged for domestic abuse offenses. We go into quite a bit of detail on domestic abuse, and as you'll hear, Alison has an enormous wealth of knowledge about the dynamics of this subject. We discuss the gender demographics of domestic abuse, various strategies and habits for healthy communication, defining and identifying abuse, and the relevance of childhood abuse, self-regulation, addiction, cultural norms, empathy, mindfulness, and accountability. I found this conversation incredibly informative and helpful to me personally, and I truly believe there's something beneficial in here for everyone. And before we jump in here, I want to mention that each and every one of us is surrounded by relationships. We continually form relationships in many directions, whether or not we even want to. Aside from romantic partners, you will build relationships with coworkers, roommates, friends, family. In fact, any encounter with another person is a possible relationship and a possible instance of abuse. But it's also an opportunity for love. So while this topic is difficult to think and talk about, it's incredibly important as it applies to an enormous realm of our daily lives and habits. So without further ado, here is Alison Melia. Today I have with me Alison Melia. Alison Melia, thanks so much for joining me, Alison.
Welcome. Glad to be here.
So you and I met quite serendipitously, I would say, just like a couple weeks ago, super coincidentally, and then you were talking a bit about where you work, and I was thinking that you have this really interesting wealth of information and knowledge about an area that's important, but no one really talks about that much. So I really thought it'd be great to get you on here. So just to start, it would be great if you could describe your background, what you've been doing, how long you've been doing it for.
Yeah, sure. My background, I guess I have a degree in sociology, and I have worked in social services for quite a few years. I guess, over 10 years at least. And I'm also a yoga teacher, so certified yoga teacher. And I have been working as a partner assault response facilitator here in Ottawa for the Ottawa area and surrounding for over 5 years now. So what we do is we work with people, men and women, who have been charged with a domestic offense. And they basically are told that they have to take a court-mandated program, which is the program I run, we run it out of Counseling Family Services, and it is called New Directions. So most cities have a partner assault response program. A bigger city like Toronto would have probably more than one. Because we're the only one for Ottawa and surrounding area, we're quite busy.
So generally you're working with the perpetrators of domestic abuse and not the victims so much?
That's right. So the perpetrators come to us for this 12-week program. Now, we do have what's called an outreach part of our program. They're separate from the actual facilitators, so I don't do this outreach work. Someone else would, our outreach worker, and they would be contacting the victims via phone for support and providing support services that way, through email, through phone, and we do send them a package with resources and so on and so forth. If the victims want the support, they can have ongoing support, weekly, bi-weekly, whatever works for them. And some victims choose not to have that support.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I was wondering, I think maybe to begin, just to get a characterization of the demographics of the abusers. And I also wonder, do you have an idea of the general process of how they end up getting, I guess the word would be prosecuted? Is it usually the partner calling the police, or is it a family member, friend, something like that?
Yeah, so it could be, we get all types of situations coming to us. Usually I have the police reports in their files with me, so I'm familiar with what happened on that side of things. And the police reports are not always accurate. We have to keep in mind that it is usually the victim's statement and not a statement is not received from the perpetrator. So we get a lot of people coming in feeling that they've been treated unfairly because they haven't been heard by the legal system or by the police. So that is a point of contention at the beginning of the program for a lot of people. It can be anything from the victim calling the police, a family member of theirs, a bystander, a neighbor. It's all kinds of different scenarios arise and happen in these instances.
Okay.
As well as just, the sort of intensity of the abuse is really on such a wide spectrum, from anything from, someone throwing their phone and breaking it and getting charged with that, to, real physical violence. So just to give you an idea of the range of offenses we're looking at and dealing with.
Yeah, that's one thing that crossed my mind as I was sort of preparing for this. I figured there'd be a very wide variety of cases and just situations, and every case is so individual and unique in its own way, surely. I can only imagine. One thing I'm wondering, as you mentioned, that the perpetrators, usually they will understandably state that their side of the story wasn't really dealt with and engaged with. How do you guys engage with that? Do you generally hear it out and then say, well, we can move past this and start trying to resolve things?
Yeah, so that's a tough hurdle to get over. I work with men, so we have one group. I'll just state that now to make that clear. So my experience has been working with men. We have about 6 groups now, double that, 12, because of social distancing. We've got a hybrid model of doing half of our groups online through Zoom and then the other half in person. We've got 1 group for women a week, whereas we've got 6 groups for men just because of numbers. So I'll refer to men because that's my experience, but I want your listeners to keep in mind that women are charged, and this isn't a gender just men thing. Women do abuse as well. So at the beginning of the program, if I have 2 or 3 guys who are upset about the system and the way they've been treated, it can really throw the direction of the group off. And we sometimes I think there needs to be a whole other group, for a support group for people who are just frustrated with the system, and because it's just so common. And I have to, unfortunately, at the beginning, first session, I'll allow them some space to vent, but then I'm reminding them basically that this program is about accountability, and now that they have to be here. They're in the program, and the point of the program is to focus on, abusive behaviors that they've used in their past, whether it be at the time of the referring incident or at some other point in time in their lives, and to take ownership for that and start to build self-awareness around that and what leads them to use those kinds of behaviors. So once we get over that, some guys will really push and continue to bring it up. Just have to, as a facilitator, constantly redirect them to focusing on themselves and what they can control, because we can only control ourselves. Really, we can't control, and I can't change the system. And dwelling in that place, and the victimhood place, is really a disempowering place to be. So I do my best to try to get them out of that headspace.
Yeah,
and get
absolutely.
them to recognize that it's really not helpful to them. And it's really not the place, I guess, to do that. It's helpful, I think, for them to be heard and maybe their feelings to be validated at the beginning, but to dwell on it and to continue to talk about something we have no control over is just pointless to the program.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. It would be delicate, but it sounds like that is the most sensible way to really reorient things. I also wonder, as you mentioned this, do you find yourself since you're dealing with mostly or exclusively male clientele, do you find that they will sort of attack your gender and say that you don't understand their perspective because you're a woman?
Yeah, so funny enough, like we try to, so at the beginning of each group, we preferably would have a male and a female co-facilitator. So I'd be co-facilitating with a male for the first hour of the group. And the first hour, we basically educate them on the tools of the program. The second hour, we split them up into smaller groups, and I would be alone with my quote unquote smaller group, which could be about 15 men because our groups are so large. And funny enough, most of the time I get the opposite. So I do like to bring that up right from the beginning and recognize that I'm female, I'm coming from a female perspective. And, and also we could do a better job at our content is very oriented toward heterosexual couples. So we do tend to work one-on-one with gay or LGBTQ plus demographic because they might not feel comfortable in the group. So a lot of men say they prefer to have a female co-facilitator, I guess because they feel more comfortable opening up. Some men would prefer a male, and I think it just helps for me to point it out right off the bat that first of all, I'm female. I recognize I can't fully relate with your experience. Second of all, I always tell people I'm not here as a relationship expert, and I am definitely not a relationship expert. I'm here, I'm a good facilitator and I'm a good group therapist. So those are my skills. I learn from them and I tell them that. I learn from the group dynamics. We are here to learn from each other. I've learned from the program a ton. It's a great program that's been put together over the years and it's evolved over the years. And yeah, so hopefully that I don't want to have a space where they feel that I'm sort of above them in any way, or that there's any sort of hierarchy, so that there's no judgment involved there either, on my end. Yeah, so it's all part of sort of building and creating that safe space at the beginning of the program.
Okay, that's good. And I guess I'll have to bear in mind that you're not a relationship expert here because it's so easy to start digging into the specifics of how to manage relationships generally. And their relationships are so unbelievably complex. I feel like every time I deal with any new relationship, be it a friendship or a family member relationship evolving or a romantic relationship, it always is extremely complex and nuanced and detailed. So yeah, the specifics of that, we'll get into it a bit, but we'll try to be general, I suppose. And before we get there, I have one other question about the demographics here. I wonder what you think, especially because you have that sociology background, I wonder if you think that there's a social stigma that influences this disparity between men and women, because you were mentioning you guys have one group for women and 6 for men, so it's about a 1-to-6 ratio. Do you think there's a social stigma against perhaps heterosexual men reporting on female partners abusing them? That certainly seems like I've heard that claim.
Yeah, definitely. And we talk about with my groups who are male, we do talk about social stigmas around because some of them bring up, well, she was being physically abusive towards me, and so I reacted, right? And I validate that, and we acknowledge that, yes, men and women can both become abusive, both verbally and physically in a relationship. I do try to point out and ask them, we talk about abuse and the fact that it's about the effect on the other person, not necessarily the intent. So you might not intend to hurt someone with your behavior, but if they are hurt, that's what matters. And I also, if I have a guy saying, well, she was she was pushing me. She was blocking me from leaving the room. She wouldn't let me leave. So I had to get my hands on her and move her. I often ask the question, were you scared for your physical safety when she was, pushing you or blocking you? Mm-hmm. Most of the time, not all the time. I'm not saying that men don't get scared of women. There can be, I'm sure this does happen, that they are really scared for their physical safety, especially if she has a weapon or is larger than him and stronger than him. This does happen. But I do like to ask, were you scared? How did you feel? Like, what was the effect? And then ask, how do you think she felt? So we really work on empathy, which is a skill you have to build, and it does demand some high level processing, and it's a skill that not everyone has developed throughout their life. So we really work on them getting into her thoughts and feelings, or at least trying to guess. And oftentimes the answer will be, yeah, I think she might have been intimidated by me, or scared, possibly scared. So that's something we really look at. But again, yes, I do probably, there are men who don't report, and there's a lot of cases that go unreported. So where men are being abused, both verbally and physically. And so it's just as important of a topic for victims of abuse who are male.
Yeah, I would very much like to discuss empathy in a little more detail later on if we have time. One thing, bouncing off of what you're saying there, I came across this sort of social response to males claiming abuse against them myself, because I wasn't sure how I should bring this up, because I don't want to frame myself as a victim or anything, but I was in a relationship that I think could potentially be reasonably described as abusive, and it was certainly characterized that way by my friends. And there are a couple of interesting things I noticed from that. Firstly, after the relationship had concluded, when I told people about it, and if I opened up and really tried to say that, yeah, it was abusive, oftentimes the response would be confusion. I'm trying to remember. I think there were about 2 or 3 times that instead of getting immediate, concern or care, the response was, why were you in that relationship? What were you doing there? And I don't know if that's a common response for women when they're talking about their the abuse they've dealt with, but it was a little bit odd that people were confused, because to me it was so obvious why I was still there. I wanted to make the relationship work. I cared about
you love
her.
This person.
Of course, yeah. So, but I would get this confused response, and I wonder if that's due to a social stigma where it's this idea like, you're a man, you can just leave. Like, you're not trapped because you're a man. I don't know if this is legitimate, though. This is mostly just anecdotal personal experience. But
no, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think men do go through this and are in abusive relationships where they're being, there's all kinds of things going through my mind as you bring this up. Narcissism, spectrum of narcissistic tendencies, and the empath attracting one another, and that can be on both. Doesn't matter, it's male or female, right? Then there's also what was I going with this? I'm just trying to find my train of thought, because so much has come up. I'm glad you brought that up.
Take your time.
I guess the questions I would ask if I were you to ask yourself would be, how did you feel in that relationship? And what were the abusive behaviors? How did it impact you? Was this person willing to work on it? And we teach assertive communication. So it's basically communicating in a way that asserts your needs and boundaries without being verbally abusive back. And one of the points of the program, and just to bring this up, is we used to be open to voluntary clients who wanted to come in to just improve themselves as a partner, which I think this program, which so many guys say, I wish I would have had this in high school or, in my early 20s. I wish I would have known this stuff then. But one of the points of the program is to broaden the definition of abuse. So often when we hear the word abuse, we think physical violence, but there's so much more, right? There's verbal abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse, financial abuse. We look at coercion and control, and this really takes a toll on someone's self-worth, someone's mental health. And so that's really important. So we want people to leave the program understanding and that abuse is so much more, and so that they're more aware of their behaviors and more mindful of how they interact in a relationship going forward, right? And that comes with learning how to self-regulate, right? Self-regulation. What are your triggers? And then we look at something like how are you? Because sometimes when you're in a relationship that is abusive, if you don't have the emotional regulation skills, because I myself have been in relationships where I feel were abusive as well, right? And so for myself, earlier on, before giving this program, see, this is how much I've learned from it. It's almost like, I feel like sometimes I say, alcoholics who have recovered are the best at leading an AA group or supporting and running groups. I feel like I'm a recovered, person who's been in struggling toxic relationships, and so that I can relate in that sense. But I'm still responsible for my reaction, right? And we look at the difference between reacting and responding. And when we're reacting, our brain is in fight, flight, or flight or freeze mode. And we're acting from our amygdala, our old brain, and our whole prefrontal cortex is offline. So we can't think rationally. And that's when we often say and do things that we might later regret. Right? So even though the person is being abusive towards us, sometimes in our reaction, we can also get abusive. So we want to learn how to regulate our emotions. And Tara Brach, who is, I believe, is a psychologist and meditation teacher, teaches something called RAIN. It stands for recognize, allow, investigate, and nurture when it comes to. So you recognize you're triggered. You allow the feeling to come up without reacting to it, which is really hard to do. Investigate. So ask yourself questions about it. Why am I feeling this way? What's bothering me? What did this person say that's bothering me? And nurture. So bring in self-compassion. Maybe spend some time with yourself before responding. Sometimes it takes a time out and communicating, listen, I can't talk about this right now with you. I need to take some time on my own and come back to it so that you can respond in a place of regulation. Right?
Yeah, I will say that from my experience with that relationship, I feel like the way I engage with anger has completely changed. This is something I intend to talk about more in my YouTube channel, because I used to get angry easily, and it became clear to me through my experiences in that relationship that anger always made everything worse. And now at this point, I never see a useful, a good reason to get angry in any situation. It's pretty amazing. Just my mind totally reframed anger as consistently counterproductive. So I don't bother letting myself react like that anymore. So I think RAIN very much connects to that too, though I never really explicitly thought about it that way before. One other thing I'm thinking of as you say this is you mentioned the difference between the effect and the motive. And in my experience with abusive relationships, I remember if people were trying to tell me the relationship was abusive, my immediate response would be, yeah, but I know for a fact he or she, whoever the person is in this situation, doesn't mean to be doing harm. It's an accident. They're not their best self at that moment. Afterwards, there is some regret, I'm sure, that they're not the same person at that moment as their best self that I've seen in other instances. So I wonder, how often is it that the perpetrators of abuse don't know that they're being abusive, and it's really completely unintentional? Is that usually the case?
So it depends. Sometimes it is the case. I wouldn't say usually, but I mean, often can be. It's funny, so that's very empathic or empathetic, I should say. It's pathetic of you and generous of you to be saying that about that ex-partner, right? But you need to be coming at it from a place of an internal locus of control. Like, how is this making me feel? And how does it feel to be treated this way? So in assertive communication, you would say, listen, when you choose a specific behavior she was using towards you, like, I'm just going to make something up. When you scream at me and call me names, it makes me feel really hurt. I need you to stop that. Like, that's a boundary for me. Okay. And then if she was to cross that boundary again and again, then it comes to a point of you choosing to walk away, and that would be your responsibility. For if you were to stay in that relationship longer, you're knowing that this is not changing, then becomes, you're responsible for making that choice. So you want to walk away from a situation before it becomes worse, if it's not getting better. See what I mean? Like, that's where both victim and or perpetrator can both take responsibility and take action and agency over themselves. And that's a tied to self-worth often. And sometimes we get in these what's called trauma bonds, where we're with a partner who's fulfilling something that, or it's mimicking a relationship that we had in early childhood with a caregiver, right? That there was some unhelpful or unhealthy pattern there. It feels familiar, and it's high chemistry. But sorry, I don't think I answered your question. So sometimes we have men who unintentionally are just very reactive, and they can't, it feels like an out of control experience. Other times we do have men who are more calculated, and it's about power and control for them. And that, again, comes from a place of deep insecurity, even though that they might be not be at a point of enough self-awareness to recognize that. But they need to feel like they have control over that other person.
Okay.
And it's intentional.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. So yeah, this really gets down to, I guess, a big chunk of this conversation that we should be having, which is identifying and characterizing abuse. So this, I'm sure, is incredibly complex, but already there's so much interesting and important information here that you've mentioned. But just to begin, how would you define abuse more generally? Is there a way that you define it for your clientele?
Yeah, so it's any behavior that has the effect of hurting or controlling someone else.
Okay.
The effect and we talk about effect all the time.
Okay.
So if you've hurt someone else's feelings, if you've made them feel stifled or trapped, unintentionally or intentionally, it's abusive.
Okay, yeah, that's a helpful way to orient it, just thinking about effect primarily. I think it's a helpful way to simplify it, because I feel like in a lot of cases, it's easy to get wrapped up in the causes and motivations, and usually there's a complicated mixture, I can imagine, of motivations that are contradictory at times, so that can make it more confusing. But just thinking about what is the effect of the behavior in this case. So then the next question would be, how does abuse happen? What are the common causes or influences that lead up to it?
Well, that's a loaded question, but common causes. I mean, a lot of it stems from childhood, people's childhood wounds, lack of self-awareness. Someone high in narcissism might tend to be more towards using behaviors that are abusive. Someone who can't or who has a very reactive nervous system and doesn't have the emotional regulation tools. Addictions can play a part. So someone who's in active addiction can obviously, act in ways that are not healthy. And so there's all sorts of, there's also cultural components to this. people coming here from other countries where certain behaviors are not, viewed as abuse or viewed as something that would be considered an offense, a legal offense, and then they come here and all of a sudden they've been charged and, they're in shock and they've been pulled away with a no contact order and they can't see their wife and children. So yeah, there's all kinds of reasons, but a lot of it stems back to childhood and what you were role modeled, and the beliefs and expectations you developed about relationships throughout your life.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I think it would be helpful if we went through each of the things you kind of mentioned there and broke them down in a little bit of detail. So you mentioned childhood, self-regulation, addiction, and culture. I can imagine, I can see how each of those has its own unique relationship to abuse. So starting with childhood, how is it, what are the mechanics of childhood trauma influencing later abusive tendencies?
So children who are just, witnessing or in earshot of even parents just arguing. So we're just looking at yelling. There doesn't have to be any physical violence necessarily for there to be a serious impact on a child's developing brain. And this has been proven. So even a child growing up in a household that, just feels unsafe and is unpredictable, someone has an out of control temper that they could lash out at, and it doesn't. So children who are the indirect, are at an indirect sort of place where abuse is happening between father and mother, and it doesn't necessarily have to be physical, the impact on that child's development is just as bad or worse than direct abuse. And that's something that's astonishing to me. So, and also the younger the child is, the more sponge-like their brain is. So people think, oh, it's a baby, they're not going to remember, which is true. They're not going to remember, and they don't have the developmental capacity to understand what's going on. But their nervous system is syncing up to the nervous systems of those around them. So if cortisol is going off in their bodies, that's going to impede their brain development. So that's when we can later see things like, acting out in school, behavioral issues, and mental health disorders or issues, struggles. So it's basically, that's why we do, if you can't make the relationship work, and if you're unhappy in your relationship, and if you've tried, then it usually, even though this is another trauma for children to go through their parents divorcing, in itself, it's almost like that damage that will do is the lesser of two evils of two parents staying together in this toxic dynamic, right? There's something called ACEs by Nadine Burke, Dr. Nadine Burke. ACEs are adverse childhood experiences. So adverse childhood, there's about 10 adverse childhood experiences, and if you have a score of 4 or more, then your chances of developing, heart disease, cancer, mental health issues, struggles in relationships in adulthood skyrockets, right? So, and these adverse childhood experiences are things like divorce, having a parent who suffered with a mental health issue, having parents fighting in the home often, neglect, right? Physical or emotional abuse from a parent, moving places, so a lot of instability, that kind of thing.
Okay, yeah, so that definitely helps characterize things for sure. And it's something that I think is a little bit counterintuitive as well. I think very often the assumption is that if you witnessed abuse as a child, your perspective on what is abuse changes, and you don't realize those things are abusive, which I'm sure that plays a role too. But I don't know if people realize so much that witnessing abuse genuinely damages just psychological development. It inhibits psychological development in significant ways.
Yeah. So important to know that. And so important, again, when we say the word abuse, I'm not talking about hitting, punching, kicking. I'm just that. I'm talking about just yelling or arguing in an unhealthy way, because there are healthy ways to argue. And children need to see their parents, having some arguments, but and emotionally regulating themselves, and then doing the repair work, because the repair work is so important. And now, saying all this is not to say that if you have experienced this or been exposed to this as a child, I mean, the beautiful thing about the brain is that we can change. We know now through neuroscience that we can heal our brain through mindfulness, through meditation, through, healthy eating, this kind of thing. And we can do better, and with the knowledge, and when we know better, we can hopefully do better. So it's not all gloom and doom there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think anybody who has changed or evolved despite adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, I think it's great if people talk about that. I think it should be more common and comfortable of a social conversation. That's one of the things I'm really trying to do with my podcast here. It's difficult to bring up my own personal experiences, but yeah, like I will say that I used to have anger issues to some degree, and I'm sure it had to do with many adverse childhood experiences, but that I've genuinely resolved that.
That went unprocessed.
Right.
Yeah.
I suppose so. Yeah. It's difficult to actually like recognize this from a personal perspective, but I encourage listeners to really think about like what childhood experiences have affected you, and how you can watch for their effects and actually reorient your responses and your habits that may have developed because of these influences on you. So, and that brings us right to the next thing you were mentioning, which is, I guess, self-regulation. So how would you, I guess, define self-regulation, and why is it lower in some people and higher in others?
Yeah, good question. So it can be, self-regulation is the ability to bring your nervous system into a point of parasympathetic. So parasympathetic is that rest and digest state, and to bring your brain, the prefrontal cortex, back online. Dan Siegel, who's a psychologist, has a great hand model of the brain, just very simple. So it's just very simple neuroscience where you make a fist and your thumb goes underneath your fingers go on top of the thumb. When you get triggered by something a partner does, or even a colleague, so in any relationship really, when something triggers you, we can use road rage, for example. You get cut off in traffic, and maybe that's a big trigger for you. You flip your lid, is what we call it. And so that your fingers open up, you're no longer acting. So those fingers, represent the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex goes offline, you flip your lid, your fingers open up, you're acting from that thumb, the amygdala, the old brain, fight, flight, or freeze, which is our alarm center. And you're then going to either fight, if you're a fighter, by yelling, screaming, right? Flipping them the bird. Or some people shut down. So flight, which is, some people just go inward. They can't communicate. They avoid. They're avoidant of conflict, and that makes it really hard in a relationship as well. Or freeze, which is sort of like that deer in the headlight response, which is, again, neither of these things are helpful, but they were there for our survival purposes, right? When we can use breathing, become conscious of our breathing, any kind of mindfulness technique, bringing in your 5 senses to help calm your nervous system down, it takes a minimum of 90 seconds for that prefrontal cortex to slowly come back online. Now, I say minimum of 90 seconds, depending on how triggered you are, depending on how dysregulated you are and how much that experience impacted your nervous system. It could take you a whole day, right, to regulate. Different people, so if you were someone who had a parent whose nervous system was very, they get triggered really easily. So we say they have a finicky lid that flips more easily than, say, someone else, right? Because of whatever, so we're looking at intergenerational trauma right now. So whatever kind of childhood they experienced. And so that's partly genetic, and it's partly nature and it's partly nurture, right? So for myself, I was a really colicky baby. I was born, my parents are great parents. I want to say that off the bat. They're wonderful people, and I'm close to both of them. But my mom struggled with anxiety. My dad struggled with depression. I had colic and was up screaming. My mom wasn't really, I don't know that either of them had the tools to keep themselves regulated through my screaming, right? So, and then they divorced when I was 3. So that all happened before the age of 5. And that's a really 0 from in utero to 5 is a really crucial time in brain development for children. So I tell my groups that, I'm someone who's very reactive, and I have this nervous system that gets triggered a little more easily than maybe, say, someone else in comparison to, I don't know, it depends who you're comparing yourself to. So when I am triggered, I need to work a little harder, maybe, to bring my nervous system, my prefrontal cortex back online. Now, doing yoga, meditation, mindfulness, I think over the years I've been able to heal parts of that. But it's still, it's always a work in progress. I hope that answers the question.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's all extremely useful. And once again, it's unfortunate that I don't think this is a very common, I guess, just public discourse conversation. Even in schools, I think there are improvements, but there's plenty of room for more improvement in terms of explicitly discussing things like that. So moving on from self-regulation, you mentioned addiction. So how does addiction actually end up provoking abusive tendencies?
So when you're drinking alcohol or using drugs, your lid flips, right? Yeah. So we're look back to this hand model of the brain. Your prefrontal cortex goes offline, and again, depending on who you are, maybe it goes offline for some people after 2 drinks, and maybe others it's like 5 or 6, and that can change throughout the course of your lifetime. And so you say and do things you don't think before you speak, right? So and so you're in a more reactive state usually. So often people struggling with addiction who can't stop drinking or can't stop using, they're in a constant state of fight, flight, or freeze. So they're in survival mode, and they just aren't behaving in healthy ways. So we do like to point out in group that, abuse doesn't come in a bottle. So there's still, even though you were abusive and you think, oh, well, if I hadn't had those drinks, I wouldn't have acted that way. There's still those emotions, that anger. So you brought up that you felt like you were an angry person. I always like to remind the guys that anger is not a bad thing to feel, right? This is a human emotion. It's okay to feel anger. You don't want to stop. What you don't want to do is suppress it, avoid feeling it, distract yourself from it. So when we look at addictions, like there's severe addictions like alcohol and drugs, obviously, and we get participants in the program with those issues, and I think that they need to be sober and be going to a regular support group like AA or NA or whatever works for them before they come to this group, because it's not going to be useful. Our program is not going to be useful for them if they haven't done the work to be sober. But social media, come on, we're constantly distracting ourselves from our feelings, right? And just processing feelings. So easy to distract ourselves from things like anger. And a lot of men, and this is hopefully changing, and I think it is slowly, that are raised in a way, and parents have the best of intentions, but when a little boy, and sometimes even parents do this with little girls, they fall off their bike and it's not a big fall, and and they have a little scrape, and you say, oh, you're okay, toughen up, it's okay, don't cry, you're fine, because we're uncomfortable. We get uncomfortable with those emotions that they're having. And we also want them to be strong and resilient. But really, if you want them to be resilient, you need to be able to hold space for their hard emotions, like crying. And often when we see a little boy crying, sometimes, depending on how we were raised, especially men, think, no, you can't cry. That's going to lead to you getting bullied in the schoolyard. You're going to look like a wuss. This is so unhelpful, because then boys are taught they can't cry, and all that sadness turns to anger later, right? You can explode because you weren't made space. You didn't have a healthy adult who could remain regulated in their own nervous system and hold space for you to have tears, right? And then shame comes up as an adult. When you feel sadness or tears come up, it's accompanied by shame, which, and if you feel a lot of shame, then eventually you get angry at yourself, and it's this downward spiral.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
So important to really teach our boys that it's okay to cry, to validate. So children need their emotions validated, especially hard emotions, right? Even adults need their emotions validated. So in a relationship, we talk about the importance of validating someone else's feelings. Like, oh, wow, that must have been scary when you fell off your bike. Your knee must really hurt, and comfort, right? And that allows them to, as soon as you get validation from someone else that this feeling I'm having, even though it's intense and feels, not a fun feeling, it's normal, it's human, it's okay. So then you don't have that shame coming up on top of the feeling, which is already hard enough to process.
Yes, absolutely. Wow, really interesting looking at the dynamics of those emotions. I also, it strikes me when you mentioned social media there, that's another one of those, I think, subtextual or like hidden influences on everybody right now. I think almost everybody or most of the world is developing an addiction or already has an addiction to social media. I've certainly dealt with it myself, and there's this strange feeling when you're just trying to enjoy yourself on a day, maybe it's a day off, and you're just relaxing, and maybe you're with a friend or a partner, and you have this opportunity, you're not working, you can just enjoy your time with them, and yet for some reason you're craving to pull away from that experience of the real world at that moment, and you just it keeps reactivating in your mind. So you're not even necessarily just like zoned in on your phone, but even while you're trying to enjoy the moment, your mind keeps going, oh, why don't we check our phone again? And that can be frustrating in this way that you don't even notice. It's just in the background, there's this noise. It's almost like background noise. And it's making it, at least for me, it can make me more agitated on a day when it should be the exact opposite. I'm free to do whatever I want at this moment. So I shouldn't feel agitated by temptations towards not enjoying the moment right now. It's a strange dynamic, but it's one that I encourage listeners to really look out for. And this is not just social media, pretty much any addiction, anything that you feel constantly craving for when you don't necessarily have any good reason to be craving it at that moment.
And the act in itself is not bringing you anything positive or healthy necessarily, right?
Right, exactly.
And it's taking you out of the flow of being in the present moment. Yeah.
Yeah,
definitely.
absolutely.
Good point.
Yeah. So I'm noticing the time here. I think I can reduce what I wanted to ask here to about 3 questions. But I do think it would be great if we can touch on culture a little bit. I know that is worth its own ginormous conversation, I'm sure, but you did mention that it can influence abuse. I guess how prominent is this is a useful question. Do you see it surprisingly often here in Ottawa, like a cultural influence towards abuse?
I mean, I think it's important just to know that abuse is not something that only happens to people who are lower class, or anyone can be prone to using abusive behavior, right? It doesn't, but yeah, culture and belief around relationships and what's normalized, I guess, what was normalized to you growing up could be unhelpful. So no matter who you are, what cultural background you come from, you want to ask yourself, what was role modeled to me when it comes to intimate relationships growing up? And is that healthy? Were my parents in a healthy, interdependent, mutual, respectful relationship, right? And if you're coming from a culture where, the man is sort of the dominant figure in the household, or there's some kind of power hierarchy, then, that can lead to that is in itself, right? Somewhat abusive.
It's difficult to speak about culture because everybody has their own culture, and it doesn't feel comfortable to just identify some culture that's a problem. And more than that, it's complicated to look at because culture doesn't necessarily affect every single person, but it's this larger scale influence on how people tend to behave within a large society. I will say that I've noticed in Russian culture, because I'm Ukrainian, and Russian culture just doesn't talk about abuse, really. I mean, it's almost like a word that just doesn't come up ever. I mean, I've never heard it come up. Now, it's not like I talk to that many Russian, deeply Russian people. I'm here in Ottawa, but from what I've seen, it's kind of just not mentioned. Even if it's coming up in a conversation, it doesn't really explicitly get talked about. So even that alone, if a culture doesn't talk about abuse, then it's not identified, and then no one's really pointing it out or concerned about it as much. So that's one way this could happen. So moving on from culture, there are a few things I wanted to ask about. One thing is you mentioned empathy, and empathy is such an important tool to teach. So I wonder, how do you go about teaching and explaining empathy in a rehabilitative approach to the perpetrators that you deal with?
Yeah. So first of all, we can't use empathy when we're triggered and our lid is flipped. So when we're working from our alarm center, it's impossible to use empathy because rational thought happens in the prefrontal cortex, right? So you're not thinking rationally.
So empathy is entirely a prefrontal process, essentially?
Yes, high-level processing. So you need to be able to emotionally regulate. So you need to get that down pat before you can use the skill of empathy. So we explain empathy as the ability to try to understand what someone else is thinking and feeling. And that's hard to do when we're in an argument, right? But we actually use empathy, and I this is the wording I use. I say, I'm going to teach you empathy as a tool to have in your back pocket and a strategy to de-escalate a situation rather than escalate it. Because when we're reactive and when we're acting from our alarm center of the brain, our natural gut instinct is to be defensive. When someone's angry at us, we automatically jump to defense. And when we get defensive, that can lead to further escalation of an argument. So what we need to be able to do is stop, breathe, calm our nervous system down. And if we're able to show empathy, and the 3 steps to showing empathy are active listening, so using eye contact, nodding your head, and really listening rather than thinking about what you want to say next, right? Which is easier said than done.
Certainly.
And then paraphrasing, so saying back to the person what you understand them to be upset about. So I understand, so what I'm getting is you're upset with me because I picked up the kids late from school, 2 days in a row last week. So that must, and then validate their feelings. I can see how that would be upsetting for you, right? You don't have to agree with the person. I mean, in that case, the example I just used is pretty an obvious mess up, right? That you just want to take accountability for. But to show empathy doesn't mean you have to agree. You're just showing your partner or your ex-partner who you're co-parenting with, super important. We look at how to co-parent in a healthier way for the kids. You want to show them that you're trying to understand and what they're thinking and validate what they're feeling. Right. So if you're thinking this way, is this how you're thinking? Is this what I'm getting? Oh, okay. Yes. And the reason you paraphrase is so that there's no room for misinterpretation or miscommunication. That's why we paraphrase back. And then the third thing is asking questions if you still don't quite have a feel for what they might be thinking or feeling. And so this helps the other person's nervous system, hopefully, as soon as they feel seen and heard, because that's what people need in relationships. That's what we all need as human beings, is to feel seen and heard and understood. That is going to help their nervous system calm down. And the hope is that it leads to a de-escalation and room for a healthier argument or disagreement to occur.
Yeah, right? Absolutely. And it strikes me as you say that I think for some people, at least because I've seen this in my own experience a number of times, there can be a little bit of anxiety that's rooted in not understand in feeling like you have to pretend like you understand exactly what the other person is thinking, and that's okay. And that anxiety is something you don't even realize is happening. It's very, very subconscious, but you feel like you have to pretend you understand the other person. And once you've dropped into this argument, you can't suddenly back off and be like, oh, actually, I didn't understand what you're saying this whole time, because it feels like you're giving up on this performance you've created. So you feel trapped in pretending like you understand the person. So I find it helpful to be really like exercise like exaggerated humility and be like, okay, you know what? Maybe I just don't know what you mean here, and so just being honestly curious about what the other person is feeling, and that's way easier said than done.
Way easier said than done when you're triggered and when someone's upset with you or an argument's happening. But if you can calm your nervous system and get curious about what's going on for the other person. Curiosity is key instead of defense. So in place of when you feel yourself getting defensive, notice it. Think, I'm getting defensive here. Can I take this less personally? Because it's about them being upset about something, and get curious about what's going on for them emotionally. Now, you're not responsible for someone else's emotional state or to regulate someone else. That's their responsibility. But when you show that you're willing and trying to understand where they're coming from, then that's going to help you connect.
Yeah, absolutely. So the second last question I have, do you have time for a couple more questions?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. The second last question I had was, so you mentioned mindfulness quite a bit, and mindfulness I can see, especially because I've been practicing meditation now for a good 2 years, and I can finally confirm that there really are fascinating benefits to it. It's very easy to be skeptical at first, especially in the early stages, because it feels like you're just wasting your time, and it's so difficult too. But once you do it really long enough and commit, it's really interesting to notice the benefits. And I just wonder, do your clientele struggle with actually embracing this concept of mindfulness at all? Do they think it's BS?
Yeah, definitely. They think it's BS sometimes. So at the beginning of every session, I like to lead them through a breath meditation where we just focus on the breath. And especially when we're running Zoom groups, if I peek and I open my eyes a bit, I can see guys just not engaged at all, and they're not giving it a fair shot. But that's out of my control. I can just tell them what the benefits are. And there are a lot of guys, and we get a lot of feedback, who say the breathing really helps me. And I've used it outside of group, and I'm so surprised at how much it's helped. So we do get a lot of feedback where guys who do use it are want to tell us, wow, the breath work, the breathing meditation, it's really helping. It's really helping me. So there's that, which is nice to hear.
I think the general way I would describe it for anybody listening who is skeptical And to address even me, if I was talking to my younger self who is skeptical, I would say it's an incredibly useful tool to disrupt the power that negative emotions might have on your mind. Because and this can be any negative emotion. For me, the biggest one would be anxiety, because I've dealt with anxiety a lot in my life, but first of all, I didn't know it was anxiety. I thought I had this weird, unique Danylo syndrome that nobody knew about. And then eventually I realized, oh, this is social anxiety or whatever. And then as I started meditating, without even realizing it, about a year into it, when I started feeling anxiety, it became this trigger to just become mindful at that moment. It was like a signal to be, oh, this is disrupting your focus right now. Let's just bring it back to the present right now, to the breath. And it was automatic. I never consciously did it, but all of a sudden it started happening more and more. And that's just one example. It's just suddenly you have this tool that will start just being used by your brain without you necessarily even having to do much, when a negative emotion is about to take over your brain and make you have way less control at that moment.
Yeah. It's like the way I describe it. And I'm so glad you as a young guy are saying this and getting this out there, because I think it's so important for guys, especially because they don't talk about this when they're as much, maybe, but as women do mental health stuff. But the way I describe it is you're creating space between your thoughts and your true self. Well, that's how I say it. So you're the observer. That's the you. Your thoughts and emotions come and go, and you don't need to believe your thoughts. They're not who you are, and neither are your emotions. They're kind of visitors. So the more space you can create, and that space is created through meditation and things like yoga, mindfulness practices, the better able you'll be to not allow those thoughts and emotions take over you, and if they do, that's okay too, but to bring in self-compassion with that too. But that's how I kind of describe it to the groups.
I like that framing, and I've heard that framing from some Buddhists teachers, like this idea that when you're not mindful, you are continually identifying with whatever thing is happening in the brain. And if it's an emotion, then suddenly you're like, oh, I'm anger now. And you don't even realize this is happening, of course, but your entire perspective is angry Danylo now. And so everything you do comes from that, but that's not true. It's totally made up because your emotions just took control for a moment.
Yeah, it's unconscious, right? And so the more we can become conscious and become the observer, the better able we'll be to emotionally regulate. Too. Absolutely. When we get upset. And I think, and it's so important for your listeners, and that you've already said it, but it has to be a daily practice for it to really, and it has to be over time. And sometimes you don't even notice the improvements you've made because maybe they're subtle, right? But to trust in the process, and to trust that meditation and mindfulness practices are so good for your mental health. It's like going to the gym for your body, or exercising, right, is so important for our health. So is meditation for our mind.
Absolutely. I mean, anybody who's exercised physically knows that there are significant periods where you feel like you're just wasting your time and it sucks to have to go and you really don't want to go. But when you push past those precise experiences and you make it a consistent thing, that's when the progress happens, and you don't even realize it's happening until one day you look in the mirror and you're like, oh wow, I totally made progress here. Or you notice that you can lift something heavier, or that's just all of a sudden you notice it, but you weren't really keeping that close of a track necessarily.
Exactly.
So the last thing I wanted to ask you about was how you navigate your job here personally. How do you sorry about that. How do you avoid becoming emotional and personally upset with the individuals you're dealing with? Especially, you're dealing with people talking about sometimes their worst mistakes, like the worst things they've ever done. And how do you not let it become this critical view where you're very critical of these people and you might think they're actually bad people or something like that? How do you avoid that?
I like to try to see them as all young boys, remember that they were children. So I try to see them from a perspective of like the hurt child in them, because I really do have a strong belief that we're all innately good. That belief helps me. And I've made enough mistakes in my past and have done things that, I'm ashamed of, so I really do relate to these guys. I mean, most of them. And it's really important for me, for them to sense that from me. Otherwise, I can't do the work. The group is not going to, the healing's not going to happen type of thing. So I'm lucky in that comes fairly easily to me. And I recognize that that's not something that everyone can do. So I'm really grateful for the fact that I'm able to do that.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
that it comes fairly naturally.
I really like that sort of mental maneuver that you're describing there of imagining or recalling the child version of your clientele, because I know that has helped me enormously, and I've noticed actually that it can help with pretty much any context of hatred or vilifying someone. When you really want to think of someone as a villain, all it takes is remembering that at some point they were 3 or 4 years old, and there's no way if you met them when they were 3 or 4 years old, you'd be like, that's a villain in the making.
Exactly.
It's just, that's just factually unsound. It doesn't make any sense. It's totally illogical. They're a 3 or 4 year old. So, everybody is coming from that place. Even the people who have committed the worst atrocities in the world have come from that place. So everybody is a victim in some sense, and everybody is a work in progress, truly. Yeah.
You don't want to dwell in that victim state, though, and let that be your story.
Yeah.
Because that's a disempowering place to be. Even when you are truly a victim, at some point, you want to change your narrative and take control of your life.
Yes.
Right? And another thing I want to point out about the program is the focus, it really is on accountability. And I've learned through the program that taking accountability, pride, ego, embarrassment, shame gets in the way of us taking accountability for our mistakes or when we mess up. But so it's an uncomfortable thing to do, but it's what builds trust in relationship and what deepens intimacy and it's a red flag if you are with someone who cannot apologize when they mess up. So you want to be able to develop that skill if you want to have a healthy relationship, and you want to look for someone who's working on developing that skill as well, because that's what builds trust, and also it builds self-worth. So when you do take accountability, the ironic thing is people have more respect for you, right? When you're able to own your mistakes. But a lot of people can't do this, and there's a big barrier of that shame that comes with it, of culturally too sometimes it's just not something you do. You don't admit, you save face. And so it's so important for people to know that it will build self-worth. It's okay and it's human to be imperfect and make mistakes, but it's how we repair those mistakes. So it's owning the mistakes, validating and recognizing how our behavior made someone else feel, and moving forward and trying to do differently, right?
Yeah. I think that's a really beautiful note to end on. Thank you so much for joining me. I think this conversation is just so important, and I really hope that education systems and public discourse start to embrace just making this a comfortable and important, and recognizing it's an important conversation and just becoming more comfortable with it.
Completely. I agree. It's been a pleasure. So thank you so much for allowing me to get some of this information out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah. I really appreciate it. Have a good day.
Okay, you too.
All right. Thank you. Bye now.
Okay. Bye.